So, Peter Diamandis has got one of those resumes that you sort of start and you never get to the end of. He's an engineer, a physician, entrepreneur. He runs the XPRIZE Foundation, which is mostly what we'll be talking about tonight, but he's also co-founded the Singularity University, I think with Ray Kurzweil. He's the author of Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think. He also flies people on these parabolic flights, the so-called vomit comet.
No, we don't call it that.
Cut the reference. He races rocket planes for fun, and is a graduate of MIT and Harvard. Tell me about the zero-G flights. You took Stephen Hawking up to do one of these. How did that work?
So, wow, that's great. That's loud. It's like, wow, okay. So in 2007, we were working on an XPRIZE back then for rapid genome sequencing, and we were trying to decide whose genomes we were going to sequence. And I had gotten introduced to Dr. Hawking. And in my first conversation with him, through his secretary, through his computer, he was well aware of what we did with the Ansari XPRIZE of opening up the opportunity for all of us, anyone who wants to go into space, to go. And in that conversation, he asked whether I could help him get a flight to space. And I said, I can't do that right now, but I could fly you into zero-G if you'd like. And he said, yes, instantly. Well, not instantly, as long as it took him to type the 3 letters. And so about a day later, we'd put an agreement together. We were actually going to do the zero-G flight as a fundraiser for ALS. He would fly. And we put out a press release announcing that we were going to fly Stephen Hawking into zero-G. A lot of publicity. I got 2 phone calls. One phone call from our aircraft operations partner. We own a 727, but we fly an airplane certificate, on someone else's certificate, who's saying, what are you, insane? You're going to kill the most famous physicist in the world by flying him in this, we pull up 60 degrees up nose, we push over the top, and you're weightless for 30 seconds, and you go down at 45 degrees to the red line of the airplane, and you pull up, pulling out 2-point Gs. It's a beautiful experience. But it was considered harrowing. The other call we got was from a government agency. I won't mention who they are, but their initials are FAA. Who said, what are you, nuts? You're going to kill this guy, and you're not allowed to do it. They said your regulations solely allow able-bodied individuals. Now you have to understand, I had started zero-G. It took me 11 years to get zero-G operational from the time I came up with the idea and pitched it to the FAA in 1993, May of 93, to the time we got approval to go was 11 years later. Right? The old saying with FAA is, the FAA is not happy till you're not happy. And you can probably feel a little bitterness here. But my comment was to the FAA lawyers who were like saying, there's no place in the federal aviation regulations that allow you to do this. And I'm saying, well, show me where it disallows me to do this. And my conversation was, listen, I'm never going away. I am not going away. I'm going to make this happen. You're going to retire way before. And ultimately, that's what would happen. It took us 11 years to get operational. But when they said you can't fly Stephen Hawking, it was like, that's exactly the reason we started this organization, was to fly anyone who wanted to go. And so I asked, luckily, the right question, which I said, who determines whether Professor Hawking is able-bodied? And they said, well, I would assume their physician would. To which I said, aha. And I went and got 3 of their physicians. First of all, I went and got malpractice insurance for their physicians. I got their physicians to write 3 letters to the FAA saying Professor Hawking is able-bodied to fly in zero-G, to which they said, it's your ass. Not quite those words. And we flew him, and we had a beautiful, perfect flight. We had a big press conference at the Space Shuttle landing facility in Orlando. I mean, it's just massive amount of media there. And one of the things that was interesting was first of all, I said our intention is to fly one parabola, one 30-second weightless parabola, and give this world's expert in zero-G, in gravity, the experience of zero-G, which was our intention. And if things go really well, we'll do 2. And they asked him at that pre-flight press conference, why are you doing this? Why are you effectively risking your life? Because here's a man who is got pulmonary issues, he's got severe osteoporosis because he's not gravity laden, he has cardiovascular issues from being bed rest. And he said, not the exact quote, but you can look it up, he said, I believe that over the decades ahead, the human race will have many challenges from nuclear, from viral, from asteroids, from whatever it might be, that it is critical for us to diversify the human race beyond the bounds of Earth. And I want to publicize this and get people excited about space. Anyway, when we went up there, we set up an entire emergency room on board the airplane. We had 3 physicians, 2 nurses. He was wired for EKG, cardiovascular, everything. And we flew the first parabola. He was rock solid. We flew the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. And at the 6th, his 2 nurses said, Professor Hawking would like you to spin him around. Now, how they know this and whether they were getting even with him, I don't know. But on the 7th and 8th parabola, we actually spun him around in zero-G. And at that point, I called the flight. I said, that's enough. I don't want to snatch, whatever, victory from the jaws of defeat or whatever it is. And we went back, and it was he had an amazing time. And it was truly one of those times where you bet the company for what you believe in. And everybody said I was crazy to do it, but it was the most important thing I did, because the origins of why I created zero-G in the first place was NASA wouldn't let me fly on their airplane. And I was like, damned if I'm not going to let other people who want to fly. And so on the heels of his flight, we changed the rules, and a few months later we started flying wheelchair-bound children who had never walked. And imagine a child who's grown up in a wheelchair, never walked, being able to fly through the airplane like Superman. It was an amazing experience for them.
So now the FAA loves you.
Now the FAA knows not to ignore me.
So tell us the XPRIZE story. It's a fascinating story. It's a great model. Just tell us how it came about, how you thought about it, and
so it's a similar story of saying the best way to predict the future is create it yourself, which is sort of something I fundamentally believe. I was born in the 60s. I grew up on the very tail end of Apollo. Star Trek was going on. There was this fundamental belief that we were a star-faring species and we were heading to the stars. And I wanted to be an astronaut. My parents are both immigrants from an island in Greece, Lesbos, and it was expected I'd become a physician. At the age of about 9, I confessed to my mom that I was not going to become a doctor, I was going to become an astronaut. She said, that's nice, son, but actually you should become a doctor. And so I said, as I got older, I realized that if you weren't a Air Force fighter pilot, your next likely profession for admission was a physician. So, okay, that sounds good. Long story short, went to MIT, got my engineering degrees, biology degree, got into medical school, and I met a bunch of astronauts. And I learned that even if you were selected into NASA, first of all, your chances are 1 in 1,000. I figured I had better chances of becoming an NBA All-Star at 5'5" than I did an NASA astronaut. And even if you were selected, you got a chance to fly. Only half the astronaut corps had ever flown. So it's interesting, right? Because you get selected, you're yay, I got in, but you don't fly. They called half the astronauts penguins because they had wings, but they didn't fly. And then if you did get to fly, if you were lucky, you'd fly 1 or 2 times in your career, and that just wasn't my mission. And so I never applied, and driven by that frustration, I decided I was going to try and open up space privately. And one day, a good friend of mine, I was getting my pilot's license at the time, gave me a book called The Spirit of St. Louis, which was written by Charles Lindbergh in 1954, I think, won the Pulitzer Prize. And in this book, I was amazed that what I learned, and there are books that changed my life, and this was one of them. The Singularity is Near, Atlas Shrugged, or some of the other books that impacted me. And as I'm reading this book, I'm making notes in the margin, I found out that there was a guy, Raymond Ortegue, who was born under the Pyrenees Mountains in France, comes to New York penniless, works his way up as a busboy at the Hotel Lafayette, becomes a hotel manager, becomes a hotel owner. And in 1919, after World War I, after aviation made its debut in the First World War, and he was enamored by these aviation pilots who were staying at his hotel, he had an idea. He said, maybe I could connect my birthplace of France and my new home of New York with aviation. And he offered up a $25,000 prize. Today, probably on the order of $10 million. And he was greeted by people who laughed at him, who said, it's a crazy idea. No one could possibly ever fly New York to Paris. It's 4 times longer than anybody ever flown. Long story short, in 1927, by the time Lindbergh made his flight, the number of people competing for this $25,000 had grown to 9 teams who had spent $400,000 going after the prize, 16 times the prize money. I'm going, that's amazing, right? I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I care about leveraging my capital. And 16 times the prize money, and you don't pay someone until after they pull it off? I mean, what's not to like? And so in the margins of the book, I wrote XPRIZE. X was the name of the person who would put up the prize money. I didn't have $10 million. I didn't know anybody who had the $10 million at the time. So that was a variable to be replaced. And what followed was a 10-year journey of announcing the prize without the $10 million, getting 26 teams to compete, frantically searching to raise the $10 million, being told no 150 times, meeting the Ansari family who finally said yes after an epic journey of finding them, and then having Burt Rutan, backed by Paul Allen, actually build the vehicle, fly, and win it by the deadline of December 31st, 2004. And it was fun.
You know, we've had that tragedy recently in Mojave.
Yeah.
Did you ever worry that your XPRIZE competition could have ended? Because that would have been it, right? If someone got killed.
It's an interesting question, right? We had many conversations about the notion of, are we in fact going to be causing people to lose their lives? Are we incentivizing people to risk their lives? And the answer was yes, we very much were. And I had those conversations. I had those conversations with the media. I had the conversations, I'll never forget, one of my most interesting and trying moments, I was giving congressional testimony back in like 2001. And there was a congresswoman actually who stood up and said, you know, Dr. Diamandis, aren't you in fact incentivizing people to try and risk their lives and to do something that could kill them? And I had an answer which I had used before, which I was very proud of, and I used it there, which was to say, you know, as Americans, and I share this with all of you who think about the fact that we may risk lives for this sort of thing. As Americans, we are sitting here because 500 years ago, thousands of people gave their lives to cross the oceans and found the New World. And then 200 years ago, they risked their lives and lost their lives again to cross the Great Plains and the Rockies and to colonize, settle California. As Americans, we do things that or as any exploring, population, we do things we care about. And it would be, for her, I said, un-American not to risk your lives for something you believe in. She withdrew her question. But I do fundamentally believe that. We have become so risk-adverse in society that it kills me, right? People forget that the day before something is truly a breakthrough, it's a crazy idea. And in government agencies, thank you. In government agencies, there's a problem, some program gets funded, and it goes like was it Solera? They got funded by DOE, and then it was congressional investigations, and you lost the money. It's like, BFD, I mean, for God's sakes, okay, you lost the money. Do more of that. Research is all about actually doing stuff that has a high probability of failure. If it wasn't have a high probability of failure, it wouldn't be research. It'd be doing stuff that you know. And so I get very upset when people become risk adverse. I think it kills us and it drives us to mediocrity. Because we are a nation of taking risks. We are a people of driving towards what's over the horizon, what's in the frontier. And as soon as we take away the risk, all we're stuck is in incremental progress.
We had Elon Musk talk to us a while ago, a friend of yours. And he is equally forward-looking, not risk-averse. He's bet his entire wealth on SpaceX and Tesla. He said, when you look at the globe today, arguably it's the best possible time to be alive on this planet. And I'm wondering, is there something in this spaceship fuel that you guys are sniffing that is restructuring the amygdala? Where does this optimism come from? Because it's very bracing.
So, I'm very, very happy to call him a friend, and he's a fan of my last book, Abundance. And it comes from looking at the data. And so, a great deal of respect for you and your work. Many of the colleagues in the news media, the news media is in a business of delivering eyeballs to advertisers. And negative news delivers 10 times the eyeballs than positive news does. And so people don't realize this, we are abused and used. I call most of the news media drug pushers. And negative news is their drug. And on every device that we have, our radios, TVs, newspapers, we are being delivered every murder, every skirmish, every problem on the planet into our living rooms in a high definition over and over and over again. And there's a reason for that, because we do pay far more attention, and because of the sliver of your finger in our temporal lobe, the amygdala, pay 10 times more attention to negative news than positive news. But by almost every measure that we have on Earth, we're living during the most extraordinary time ever to be alive, and our ability to solve problems is exploded. It used to be that only the kings and queens 1,000 years ago could solve a problem on a national or regional level. And even then, all they could do was deploy their troops. 100 years ago, it was the robber barons. It was the industrialists, the John D. Rockefellers. Today, it's all of us. Any of us who desire to truly, in our heart of hearts, want to make a difference. We have access to, tens of billions of dollars in crowdfunding. We have access to the world's information on Google, the ability to 3D print on the cloud. We have access to AI. We have the technologies at an individual's fingertips that only the governments and corporations had 20 years ago. And so the number of actors, the number of doers has exploded and is continuing to explode. And what's made the difference over the last 100 years, the improvement in literacy and health and per capita income and life expectancy and all of these things has been not smarter politicians, not smarter people, it's been technology, and that's getting better and better every day. So I think it's that fundamental looking at the data that gives me, I can't speak for Elon, the greatest hope for the future.
And your model, as I interpret it, it's fundamentally private. You don't put a lot of faith in government to solve our problems, at least.
I gave up on the government long ago.
Why?
Because the incentives are perversely wrong. That's the government coming at me right now. You guys will stop them, right? Because the government doesn't take risk anymore. And again, it's driven to incrementalism because the things that I had the greatest hope that the government would do, and this is the 9-year-old kid in me, never materialized.
And what happened? John Kennedy said in 61, let's get to the moon in 10 years. They did in 8. And that was an entirely government-funded program. What happened?
What happened was that Apollo was at the right time, at the right place, with the right incentives in place. And what the space program has become to a large degree is a peacetime employment program for the industrial military complex. And thank God that the current administration made a huge push for commercial space and backed Elon, and thank God Elon did his success in PayPal and has revolutionized launch vehicles, because it wasn't coming out of Lockheed and Boeing, and it wasn't coming out of the industrial military complex. It was an individual's desire. And I think ultimately we're living in a new era where individuals driven by their passion and their frustration are going to take on the world's biggest problems. And I do believe fundamentally all of you here, I disagree fundamentally with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates on the giving pledge. I don't think it's about giving. I think what it should be called is the impact pledge. I think people should be committing to create an impact on the planet, not just giving the money away. It's like, what is the problem you want to solve? And I ask all of you here, what is the problem you want to solve? What do you care about in your life when you wake up in the morning to solve? What problem, what issue, what disease, what employment, what is it? It doesn't matter what it is, because we now have the ability to solve these things. And I think it's a moral obligation we have as individuals who are successful, who've got wealth, who have means, to take these things on. And it may be a kid someplace on a crowdfunding with use of technology who does it, but I don't know what the wealthiest people on this planet do with their capital, because they sure are not actually driving to make impacts in the world. Because if they wanted to, much of what we have as issues could be solved.
So that brings us back to the XPRIZE. You became kind of a serial killer of challenges. You did the XPRIZE and the Ansari XPRIZE to go to space, and then you kind of spread out and did a bunch of other things. How did you choose what you were going to do next?
So the day that the XPRIZE got won, unbeknownst to me, a friend of mine at the time, Keith Powers, was talking to another friend at Google, and they got Google to change the Google Doodle to have Spaceship One flying over the logo. And so, it was very cool to have Google homepage linked to the XPRIZE. Almost took down our servers. It was way too much traffic. But I got invited a couple months later to go up to Googleplex. Back then it was only 4,000 employees. Now it's 50+ thousand. And I gave a presentation to a couple of thousand employees there. And at the end of a long line afterwards asking questions was a guy in a black t-shirt and a backpack, was Larry Page. And we had lunch. And he said, I love what you did. What do you want to do next? And I said, well, this prize model really works well. Would love to start using it to do some other impossible things. And I just on a whim invited him to join my board of trustees. He accepted. He came on. We were negative cash balance at that point as a nonprofit. He gave us a sizable donation, brought Elon on board, James Cameron, Jim Giannopoulos, Arianna Huffington, amazing group of folks. Locally here in town, also Eric Israelian, Lee Stein, who's in the audience, is our member of our board of trustees. And then we started building a group of backers, our Vision Circle members, our Innovation Board members. Andrew Naku is here with us in the front. And we now, every year at our we have a visioneering meeting here in the LA area. We invite all of our benefactors, our corporate sponsors, and we say, what is a challenge in the world that should be solvable that isn't, that is stuck? It could be the vested interests, the laws, people think it's impossible, no one's trying, whatever it might be. And we try and define a very clear point and say, the first person to do this. Give one quick example. When the BP oil, remember the BP oil spill was going on in 2010, and it was going on and on. News media constantly, it's all they showed was the oil spill for 2 months straight. Jim Cameron.
Same bird every time.
Same bird covered with oil, exactly. Jim Cameron had just joined our board of trustees, and he said, you got to do something about this. And we looked at, could we create an XPRIZE to cap the spill? No. But we looked deeper, we found out that the technology for cleaning up oil spills on the ocean surface had not changed between the Exxon Valdez 20 years earlier. In fact, it was the same equipment that was being used. And so we decided, could we create an XPRIZE to at least double the rate of oil spill cleanup, so you clean up on the ocean before it hits the coastline. I sent out a note to our board of trustees, and Wendy Schmidt, Eric Schmidt's wife, who runs the Family Foundation, raised her hand. She funded it, and we had 350 oil spill cleanup teams enter the competition. The top 10 went head-to-head, and the winning team increased oil spill cleanup rates 600%, which is cool.
Now, before we talk about the Global Literacy Prize, I want to talk about a prize that you canceled, but you canceled for an interest in the Archon Genome Sequencing Prize.
Yeah.
You set that out there, and then, well, explain why you canceled it.
So, Craig Venter, who sequenced the first human genome in 2001, he's my business partner in a venture called Human Longevity, Inc. I was introduced to him by Larry Page. Craig, when he sequenced the genome, it cost him $100 million and 9 months of time. After that, he realized that a single genome was interesting but not useful. Needed huge numbers of genomes, hundreds of thousands, millions of genomes to do statistical analysis and really do machine learning on it. So he offered at that time a $500,000 prize for the first person to reach 1,000 genomes. Larry said to Craig, "Hey, Craig, meet Peter. Peter, meet Craig. You should manage Craig's prize." I said, "That's great, but honestly, $500,000 just isn't going to cut it for something like this." So he said, "Fine, if you can raise the money." So I went out and raised $10 million for that same prize. The challenge was that we didn't have any fully registered teams. We had one or two teams that were thinking about it, but at the same time, the industry was driving the speed of genome sequencing efficiency at 5 times Moore's law. And our goal is to actually try and cause new behavior, not kiss the winner in the winner's circle after it got there. So we had not registered any teams. The industry, the business was doing fine, and so we canceled the prize. And basically, we did not take the donor's money, Stu Blussin. Perhaps he'll fund a different prize later on. But the impact, I mean, we're really focused on causing new behavior, bringing new players in, and I tell my team all the time, unless we're launching prizes that fail, we're not taking enough risks.
So the technology overtook you there. So now this Global Literacy Prize, this is a really cool prize.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's the first one that you really are applying around the globe.
Perhaps our most important prize.
Explain how this works and what your goal is there.
So we're looking for huge problems. And the problem, if you want to impact the world, there are 2 things you can do to improve global productivity, what I would call global peacefulness, and make the world a better place. It would be to increase the health around the world, make people healthier, and make people literate. And so the numbers are the following. There's about almost 1 billion illiterate people on the planet. 2/3 of those are women. 250 million of those are kids. And they live in parts of the world that we will never build schools or teach enough teachers. We can't scale humans at that rate. And we had launched a few years earlier something called the Qualcomm Tricorder XPRIZE. This was for a diagnostic device for a mom or dad at 2 o'clock in the morning when your kid is sick, not for a doctor or for a nurse. It becomes your doctor, your digital doctor that can diagnose you, tell you what you got, tell you where to go, what to do next. And that prize is going to be won this year.
You will?
It'll be won this year. We're down to the top 10 teams, and we're feeling very confident there'll be a winner. And it's about democratizing medicine. It's about demonetizing and dematerializing it. I'm a physician, but again, I think that medicine, learning and medicine, healthcare, the 2 industries will be massively disrupted this decade. Need to be, will be, no question about it. We could talk about medicine back in a minute. But, so the question is, what do we do? And we have a team, some of which are here from the XPRIZE, and we look at designing prizes. Eric Hirschberg, who's the CEO of Activision, who's one of our board trustees members, had come up at our annual Visioneering with this idea of what we now call the Global Learning XPRIZE. It was Eduphone was his name for it in this annual competition. It won Visioneering that year, and we started looking and studying that. So the question is, could you build an Android application for a cell phone or a tablet? Android, because it is a prominent operating system for the rest of the world, right? iOS is here, Android is every place else. And can you create this device, this piece of software that takes a child where there's no schools, no literate adults, nothing, and takes that child from illiteracy to basic reading, writing, and numeracy in 18 months? That's the goal. It's not, it's enough that you're able to read enough to gain access to the web, which is your portal to the world. And so that's a very basic concept. We raised $15 million in prize money, a number of benefactors, including locally Dr. Richard Merkin, folks like Tony Robbins, a number of other individuals. And we launched this at the Clinton Global Initiative and the United Nations. We have about 400 teams now registered. So here's the cool part about this prize. Unlike other X prizes where the winning team owns its intellectual property, in this case, we're going to have the winning team actually open source its IP. And my goal here is that every digital device manufactured in the planet, every Android phone and every Android tablet would have this onboard teacher free resident. So imagine if every digital device became a teacher everywhere on the planet. And I think it's the only way we can really scale at that level. And so we announced that it's a competition that will run over the next 3 years. About 18 months to collect teams, have them build their software, and then we're going to be picking a sub-Saharan African nation. The software is going to have to teach in the native language and in English. And we'll see what goes. But these are going to be, the end result over here is we're heading towards a world where artificial intelligence and a whole slew of sensors are going to enable learning to be very different than learning today. Learning to be on demand, constant throughout your life, where it's the best teachers, the best tutors, if you would, are the same for the billionaire in Manhattan and the teenager in Mumbai. The same way that Google right now is the same for Eric Schmidt and that teenager in Mumbai, right? It's massive democratization of access to knowledge. We're going to do that with healthcare and with learning as well.
I'd like to get some questions from the audience, but let me ask you just one more question before I do, and that is, when you look around the world at the various problems, challenges that we face, is there any problem that you cannot devise a way of setting a prize for? I'm sure there are many things you just haven't got around to. Is there anything you've looked at and said, geez, I just don't think our model will work for this?
So, I fundamentally believe all challenges can be solved. I think we see the problems way before we know how to solve them, but ultimately we learn how to solve them. I think the issues around politics, especially given this audience, are one I don't know how to solve. But I do think that the fundamentals that we're heading towards a world where every man, woman, and child can have their basic needs met, right? Water, food, energy, healthcare, learning, all these things. And it's a world that, for me, is a better world to live in. And we can talk about that in the course of the questions.
Cool. We have a microphone.
Raise your hand.
Put your hand up and we'll get to you.
Thank you. How do you handle prizes that get into these interesting areas, such as one of them might involve Alzheimer's, for instance, when the end point to determine who wins a prize can be fairly elusive and hard to measure? How do you know when someone's won a prize that reduces the risk of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so great question. And in order for there to really be a great prize, and I want to be clear, not all problems can be solved with prizes. Right? A prize is a screwdriver or a hammer. And we're very careful not to make everything look like a screw or a nail when we go after these things. And we probably are closer to a film studio than anything else. In other words, we have lots of scripts in development. And the number of movies we make out of them are probably one out of 4 or 5 that prizes we develop actually get launched, either because it's not a good prize or we can't actually fund the prize. So we'll develop probably 4 or 5 times the number of prizes than we actually get onto the launch pad. But Alzheimer's is a great question, right? We're working on Alzheimer's XPRIZE. We had a group of folks who came together, and the gentleman who was the driving force here wanted an Alzheimer's cure, and I was very dubious about that being a great XPRIZE. So what we're focused on right now that we're working on is, can we actually do an XPRIZE for very early detection of Alzheimer's that's very accurate? Because today, Alzheimer's is a sort of disease of exclusion or a disease of autopsy. And the question is, can you actually identify Alzheimer's early enough and have actual knowledge that that's the disease? That would be useful, because then you could start to actually measure whether drugs or treatments have an impact. So, but a good point. We had a question up front here, I think, as well.
I have a question regarding the failure of some of these endeavors. Looking back on psychology, for example, there was a big attempt in the early 1900s to black box the mind. And I think one of the reasons it was doomed to failure from the beginning, and it's cited by some of the leading psychologists who study neurobiology to get at psychology, that it was a very faulty approach because it started with an enforced ignorance and assumed they could get by without that, whereas it would have been better to spend 20 or 30 years taking the system apart, learning more. And I guess the fundamental point that I would look at is the vocabulary. Do we have the right tool set, framework, way of talking about things? See, what's opened up psychology and neurobiology now in a lot of ways is having the molecular biology to describe these processes. Whereas before, without having these intimate level descriptions, you really can't even describe what someone's mood is. So at what point are we attacking problems where we don't even have the constructed vocabulary, tool set, paradigm of technology, if you will, to attack that problem? And how do we choose those areas that we are very ripe to solve at this time, as opposed to probably being better off to solve in 30 years and resisting that temptation?
So that's a great question in that, again, I don't know that all problems are going to be great for incentive prizes. And you need to be able to describe an endpoint independent of knowing what the causative agent is. In other words, we knew that we wanted to get 3 people to go to 100 kilometers, land, and do it again within 2 weeks. I didn't care whether you used rocket engines, fairy wings, zero gravity. I mean, it just mattered of did you do it or not. And such that the public knows you did it, you know you did it, the judges know you did it. And those are the things, right? There's a very rich history of incentive prizes that died, by the way, in the late 30s. Anybody know why prizes died in the late 30s? World War II. In World War II, what happened was that the government, prizes have the element that you fix the amount of money and you don't know how much time you have. When World War II came into existence, it was like, here's all the money you want in the world, just solve it today. And so we built the industrial military complex, a lot of the aviation prizes and so forth. And I think the XPRIZE sort of rejuvenated this idea of prizes that NASA, DARPA, many other individuals and so forth have started using. But not all things are great prizes. You really need a great end target.
Hi, Peter. I'm curious, are there 3 people you can name that you think it would be interesting to have a public discussion with about the future of education?
I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
I'm curious if there are 3 people you would like to have a public discussion with about the future of education.
I I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm the father of two 3.5-year-old boys, and
That's two right there.
what's that?
That's two people.
Two people, yeah. And so I think about what their education will be like, and I think of education in different means, right? Education for elementary school, college, graduate school, and so forth. And I'll just make a few comments about education versus answer your question, if you don't mind. The first is, people ask me, what do I think? What do I need to teach my kids? And my answer is, I've got two missions for them, and that is for them to find out what they're passionate about in life, and to help them remain curious. Because I don't care what they're passionate about as long as they're passionate about something. Because I was driven by my passion and it drove me. And in this world where we're going to have AI come online and answer your questions for you instantly, and that whatever you train for today is going to be obsolete 5 years from now, it's continuous curiosity that's going to be important and driven by your passion. And then college today, I'm not a subscriber to Peter Thiel's Skip College, because I got a lot of socialization out of college, right? I learned to be independent. I learned to face criticism and have all kinds of amazing experiences. I didn't learn anything I use today in college. I just learned how to become independent in college. But having said that, it used to be that, 100 years ago in 1910, 1915, the average human age back then was 50 years old, right? Half the audience wouldn't be here. We've doubled that lifespan almost, but you'd get a degree by the time you're 21, 22, and it would last you for 30 years. And the world didn't change much in 30 years. Today, it's continuously changing, and so we have to retool what education is.
Hi, I have a really quick question. Just wondering, is registration for the Global Learning XPRIZE still open?
Yes.
Get busy.
Hi. When can you see global warming being a candidate for an XPRIZE?
I'm sorry, what was...
When can you see global warming?
Global warming.
Yeah, as
So,
being an XPRIZE candidate.
So that's a great question, and we've been looking at it in a couple of different ways. First of all, we are currently working on and getting very close to announcements about, but I can't say more than that, on a carbon capture XPRIZE. And so that's very important. The second is we've been working on a battery XPRIZE. And I think ultimately our challenge is going to be to retool our energy economy. And I think the best thing, I don't think policy is going to drive that. I think it's going to be economics that drives that. And if Elon was here or Ray Kurzweil was here and you asked them when are we going to have 100% solar economy, I think the number is getting closer and closer and closer. So, is it 20 years out for the U.S., perhaps? And so I'm very bullish on solar as a solution. Are we going to have to take more drastic changes on the environment? And can we? And this is a debate I have with Al Gore all the time, which is I think we have lots of technological solutions. It's just not anything that people want to do right now. We have, geoscale engineering capabilities. We can build a technology to block, 0.1% of the solar flux hitting the planet if we wanted. But ultimately, I think there are parts of that that are an XPRIZE.
Oh, hi, Peter. Your stories are inspirational, and your perseverance is certainly inspirational. I'm curious, could you share some experiences where you failed, where things haven't gone despite your perseverance and energy?
Oh, of course. I've started 17 companies. A good third of them, I, just put a stake through the heart of it because it just wasn't going anyplace. But ultimately, the stuff that I failed at that I was sorry about was something that I tried to do to make money and wasn't in my life's purpose. The stuff that, like Rocket Racing League or International Microspace, which was my first launch company, we won a huge contract from the Defense Department, but weren't able to capitalize it. And again, just serial failures. But, a good number of successes and a good number of companies that we'll see. But I think that's typically the case with people. And I think the most important thing I want to point out along that lines is as individuals, we're now able to really go big with our dreams. So yesterday it was announced, for example, I'm on the founding board of a company called Hyperloop Technologies that's been capitalized to actually commercialize and build Hyperloop, which is a huge, crazy venture, right? But the company's raised significant capital, and it's got an amazing engineering team, and the ability to go LA to San Francisco in 35 minutes or LA to Las Vegas in 20 minutes is a pretty compelling thing, and I think we have to take a shot at. And we'll be doing more and more of that. So, yeah, failure's fine as long as we have more shots on goal.
Hello. Are you worried about government involvement in future XPRIZes, or that may hinder the future democratization of technology?
So it's, I view, one of my biggest concerns is not about the government's involvement in XPRIZes. It's about what I think of as the clash of linear thinking governments with exponential technologies and companies. Uber, Airbnb, 23andMe, and so forth. Where you've got entrepreneurs trying to just make something revolutionarily better. The government's job traditionally, in my opinion, I welcome your feedback on this, is to stabilize things, right? Keep things so you wake up in the morning and you know that the world is the same as you went to sleep the night before. People don't like change. People fundamentally don't like change. But entrepreneurs are all about providing a service that's 10 times better or 100 times better. And so as we start to disrupt, the statistic that comes from the Olin School of Business that I quote and I believe in is that 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies will be gone in 10 years. And so that's massive disruption, right? We start to see it with things we think about as Kodak and Radio Shack and Blockbuster, but there'll be a lot more coming. And when the government tries to regulate against a technology or a company, whether it's stem cell science or whatever, all that means is the researchers and the technology goes someplace else. We live in a world of porous borders, and the IP flees, as do the people, and it happens in South Korea and China and India, someplace else, and we lose, from the US perspective, lose our dominance. That happened when Bush 43 came out, again, reducing government funding of fetal stem cell work. We went from being number 1 to number 8 in that arena. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about irrational regulation against things that can't be regulated against. On the XPRIZE front, we actually have driven regulators to change the laws. When I announced the XPRIZE in May 18th of 1996 under the Arch in St. Louis, the laws to allow for private spaceflight did not exist. And it was this competition that was, the teams were going to have to either leave the U.S. to go to compete, or the U.S. would have to change the laws. And Marion Blakey, who was the FAA administrator at the time, an amazing woman, actually said, well, we'll have to change that. And she did. And she passed the legislation that allowed for commercial spaceflight. And so our Qualcomm tricorder XPRIZE, we're actually working with the FDA because I asked the FDA commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, I said, if my cell phone is my diagnostician, are you regulating it? And the answer is yes. And all that means to me is, okay, this is not going to be deployed in the United States, it will be deployed in Africa. So those are the concerns I have.
Let's get 2 more questions, I think.
Hi. I was wondering what your thoughts were on how to create more philanthropy among people that have most of the wealth in this country and around the world, and putting their money towards things like this.
It's a great question. And I have thought about it, right? For those of you in the audience who are been successful in life and have the means, the question is, the legacy you can leave can be multiple-fold, but one of it is what fundamental change do you want to cause in the world? And the notion is that you can. You can, in fact, the beautiful thing about an incentive prize, whether you do it with the XPRIZE or someone else, is you can put a large sum of money, you say the first person to solve this problem wins, and you only pay after it's solved. It's like throwing yourself a touchdown pass. It's like, I don't get why more philanthropists and more companies or governments don't use this. It's like the most efficient use of capital ever, right? Something happens when we go from being an entrepreneur and we demand 10 times on leverage on our capital, and we become philanthropists. We're okay with 30%, on the dollar being used, instead of 10 times on the dollar being used. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Hopefully, that's not something that will plague me. The other thing is, and I've had this conversation with Steve Forbes and Kip Forbes and the Forbes family. I think the Forbes list gamifies that process, and so I'm trying to get them or the economists to create the impact list, which would be philanthropists who cause the biggest impact on the planet. So you can if you drop down from number 48 to number 52, that's okay if you go from number 5 to number 1 over here. It's human psychology gamification. And we need to, people celebrate what you measure. And so can we measure people's solving and making the world a better place versus their bank account?
Hello. Hi. So you touched on how regulation causes.
Who's speaking?
Over there. Here.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. You touched on how regulation causes both a brain drain and a capital drain. Do you believe that your optimistic vision of the future is compatible with the capitalism as we know it today, where profit is king, where companies are short-sighted and managers are absolved of any moral imperatives? Wow,
great question. I think it's a great question to end on. So I'm what you might call a libertarian capitalist, if I had to label myself, for lack of a better term. But I think we're going to see massive change in society in the next 20 years, 30 years at the outmost. And I think we're heading towards a world of what I call technological socialism. What do I mean by that? I mean, today, if you want to do research, like I wrote my 2 books and I research, I didn't go to the library once. There's this amazing thing called the Google that can help you. And I think that technology is going to zero the cost of healthcare, zero the cost of learning, reduce the cost of energy, clean water. Even, in China this year, we saw a company 3D printing houses, 10 houses in 24 hours for $5,000 each. A 3-story apartment building was 3D printed. My friend Jay Rogers, just in Detroit, 3D printed a car in 40 hours. He's going to get it down to 14 hours per print for $15,000, a full-up electric car. I mean, massive change is coming our way that people don't conceive of. You saw Jarvis on Iron Man. That's coming for all of us, within the next 10 years. So we're going to zero the cost of a lot of things and make our system much more efficient. And capitalism is going to change, because in the end, the question becomes, if things cost zero, how do you deal with that? How does society deal with that? We're going to be changing the labor markets. I mean, all I'm saying here is, and I write about this a little bit in Abundance and Bold, there are other books about it, we have a lot of change coming in society. I think we're blind, most of us, to a lot of it. And it's going to transform the world. I think it ultimately is going to make it a safer world and a better world. We're heading towards a world where you're going to be able to know anything you want, anytime you want, anywhere you want. Right? Today on orbit, you don't know this, there are at least 3 private orbital constellations that are providing high-definition imagery at half a meter to a meter resolution, live high-definition video. If you want to watch what your competition is doing in China or India, supplies going in, finished product going, you can watch it We're going to have armies of drones, whatever Google Glass becomes. You're going to have perfect imaging and knowledge, machine learning. You're going to ask any question you want and have the answer. But it's also going to change the notions of privacy, right? Privacy, to me, to a large degree, is dead. And it's going to change how we act as people. I have to teach my kids that whatever they do in public is captured forever. Right? I was a teenage terrorist. I had explosives in my closet, potassium nitrate, potassium perchlorate, sulfur, magnesium, charcoal. I'd build all my rocket engines myself. And I blew up my friend's, whatever, swimming pool. Anyway, but it changes now. And the good news about that is it becomes, in this world of knowing anything, anytime, anywhere, it's harder to do evil in the world, right? Because people are watching. And most evil is done in the dark when no one is watching. So I am an optimist. I am an optimist because I believe in the data. I believe in the trends. I believe the empowerment of people to solve the world's biggest problems.
Yeah, here's to optimism. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.